right. Hi, everyone. I'm Miranda. I am the South Hills program coordinator, and Miguel is the Jefferson Hills coordinator. Uh, so uh, Today we're going to talk about politics, which is fun and not awkward at all. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what I'm seeing. All right. So this presentation was supposed to happen during the tutor conference in the spring. However, something came up and Roberta gave a wonderful presentation on activities and talking about politics with your students. So today we're going to talk about politics, the political system in America, and the ever-changing landscape that exists. So, what makes me qualified to talk about this? Well, beyond being the South Hills program coordinator for over a year now, I spent about 6 years working in politics and political campaigns throughout the United States, especially in Pennsylvania, New York, Nevada, and Georgia. And then I also taught citizenship here at Literacy Pittsburgh for quite a while. So today I'm going to take you through a lot of the information that you would need to talk with your student or students about US politics and elections. So we'll cover background information about the US government and the structure, the history of voting, and then I will cover who we vote for, why we vote, and how to stay informed while sifting through all of the noise that can get overwhelming in society today. And then I'm going to review the process of a presidential election, how you can explain that to your students, and why Pennsylvania is specifically important right now. And then we'll cover how to help your student navigate voting for the first time if they're a new citizen or if they haven't voted before and are encouraged by discussions with you or the current political climate. So my first piece of advice is to embrace the uncomfortable. Often Americans are taught not to talk about politics, religion, and sometimes that discussion is important. So I encourage you to embrace the uncomfortable, but also be mindful of your students' experience if they are an English language learner, about what's happening in their country. Maybe they escaped a political situation, or that is one of the reasons why they came here. So be mindful of that and make sure that you keep to the facts as much as you can. There are a lot of emotions that can come forward when talking about politics because sometimes it impacts us at a very deep and emotional level. And always remember that you're allowed to stop a conversation if it becomes a problem, either for your student or for you. So just keep in check with your emotions, be mindful of your students' emotions. And if things are getting uncomfortable to the point where maybe should stop, that's okay. You can just pull the plug. That is okay. So when explaining the government structure of the United States, if your student is a new citizen, it's very likely that they're going to be aware of the basic structure of the United States government because this knowledge is needed for the US citizenship civics exam. So they'll know this breakdown of the Constitution and then the branches of government. But explaining it simply, the Constitution is the law of the land and it sets up our government. And it gives us three branches. So the first is the legislative branch, which is Congress, and the House of Representatives and the Senate make up Congress. So that's our senators, our representatives, and they're the ones that make the laws.
Okay.
And then there is
Can
the
you go out through the garage?
and then there is the executive branch, which is the president and then the vice president as well. And they are the ones that sign the laws so that they become what they are and enact them. And then there is the judicial branch, which is the courts, the highest one being the Supreme Court, and they review the laws and decide if they are legal and follow the Constitution. So it all goes back to the Constitution and setting up that government. So we're going to watch a short video, which we will share the link to this as well as my presentation um, at some point very soon, so that you can view this with your student or view it again. Perfect.
With our pursuit of
Oh, okay, there we go. So um, that was a great overview of voting rights in America, and I highly recommend watching it with your student. If your student has a lower English level, I usually play it at 75% speed, just to slow it down a little bit. But moving on, there are many reasons to vote, and this is something that I always like to discuss with my citizenship students. There's more than one reason, and everybody's reason is different. But main reasons being participating in democracy, making your voice heard, taking part in decision making that is happening at local, state, and federal levels, protecting your interests, and holding politicians accountable. Because when we don't vote, they are not held accountable to the people that they are supposed to serve. And so we also vote on a lot of things. So we vote on national offices like the president, the Senate, House of Representatives, which a lot of people are familiar with. And then we vote on state offices. So governors, state legislators, attorney general, controller, judges, and then at the local level, we also vote on mayor, city council, district attorney, judges, representatives on local councils, and then ballot measures, which can change the term limits of judges or change tax rates, uh, talking about building new structures or changing the state constitution. So these are all things that can affect at differing levels our students, but it's always important to remind them that if they want to have a say in their community and to hold people accountable, it's important to vote. So we have political parties in the United States, like many other governments in the world. But we have two major political parties. And so it's important to discuss with students the difference between the major parties, third parties, and independents. So the two major parties are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Um, a reminder for the students is, or maybe not a reminder, but teaching them about the colors and symbols associated with each one is helpful. So Democrats would be blue and a donkey, while the Republican Party would be red and an elephant, and a, also distinguishing that GOP means Grand Old Party, which is another way of referring to the Republican Party, because that can get a little confusing. Then we have third party candidates. Third parties uh, are different than our major political parties. They often are smaller, but a political party is just a organized group of people with similar ideas on how the government runs or should run. So other parties just have different ideas of how the government should run and have different priorities of what is most important to them. And then there are independent candidates. which don't run with a party. And this is something that often gets confused with people that are registering for the first time. If you register as independent, you are not registering with a party. And keeping all of this in mind, Pennsylvania is a closed primary state, which means that if your student is voting in the primary, they must vote with the party that they have registered under. So you can only vote for candidates in your party. So if they want to vote in the primary, it is important to be part of a political party. So informed voting is very important to keep students engaged, keep people engaged in the political process. So some tips to keep informed are to research the candidates. And so platforms are always available on official campaign websites of candidates, especially for president. They have lots of platform explanation. If you want to see how the candidate has voted, if they've held a public office before, they can go to Ballotpedia or govtrack.us. And this shows how these people have voted, if they have held the same beliefs that they have stated, and that they've put their vote where their mouth is. It's also really important to take the time to watch a full debate or a full speech rather than just the highlight reels. A lot of these highlights are sensationalized bits of gaffes or moments that are taken out of context. And it can be hard to be as unbiased as possible when these moments are meant to have a emotional reaction, a strong emotional reaction. So watching the full debate or watching a full speech is important for the whole context. And then one of my favorite things to do, because I love politics, is to follow the money. So there is a website, opensecrets.org, where you can see where candidates are getting their money. So companies, lobbying groups, and PACs all throw money at candidates to try to influence elections to their favor in hopes that the candidate, once they hold the office, will have them in mind and pass favorable laws, introduce favorable laws, or vote against things that are not in the interest of the company, group, or PAC. So you can take a look at the website, see where the money for each candidate is coming from, whether it is a publicly run company, a private donation, a political super PAC. You can see all of that. And then it's always important to fact check the claims that you're hearing. And so you can use PolitiFact, factcheck.org, or Snopes, or any reputable source to check claims that are made by candidates, because there are often things that are thrown out in the spur of the moment during debates or during speeches that were not planned, and sometimes these are not facts. So we need to check them to make sure that they are actually true. When looking at campaign ads and materials, some things that you can do to help your student is review how to identify credible sources for news stories. So there is a lot of advertising and sponsored articles that happen on a daily basis, that are published on a daily basis. And a lot of times headlines are trying to get your attention. So reading the story and figuring out if that matches up with what the headline says is important. And then it's also important to distinguish between the straight news reporting and editorial content. Editorial content is usually labeled, or an advertisement is usually labeled, but sometimes it can be hard because they're trying to make sure that it's difficult for you to distinguish between what is fact and what is opinion. So it's important to identify those credible sources and then always think about what the story says, why it was written, and who is writing it. And then it's important to also research the candidates, because just being on their campaign website or looking at a mailer that came in your mailbox is not going to tell you everything. And it's important to see where they stand on the issues that are important to you. And then it's also really important to ask questions about the source of the information. As I said, why it was shared. So if your student sees an ad on TV or on a streaming service or gets campaign mail, one thing that you could do is encourage them to bring it to class, and you can look at it together and find the facts. You don't have to both be part of the same political party or have the same views to just look at something and dissect it, try to figure out what is fact and find out what is true in what they have. Many ads and mailers don't put the party of the candidate on the material because it limits who pays attention to it. So a rhetoric professor of mine once said, you have the distance from the mailbox to the trash can to catch a voter's attention. Because most of us will take the mailer and put it directly in the trash. So a surefire way to tell a candidate's alignment, if you know how your student is more aligned and you want them to, be aware of this, is there's always a mark on a mailer that was printed by a dues paying members of a union, a labor union. And so a Democrat will always have that bug, is what it's called. This will always have that. Well, Republican mailers usually will not have this mark. So that is a way to tell if your student asks you, how do I tell the difference between these mailers? That's a way to tell. But again, it's also about looking at the fact and looking at what is fact and what is sensationalized opinion or claims that may not be true. Because both parties everybody tends to exaggerate the truth in order to get people to go out and vote for them. So, fake news. We heard a lot about it in 2016, 2020. We're hearing a lot about it now. So, fake news refers to stories that are intentionally misleading or false. So, fake news can be claimed to discredit people who have an opposing political viewpoint from someone, or it could be a joke or satire. A great example of that is The Onion. But more and more, it feels like articles that are published by The Onion could be true. So for those who English is not their first language, sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish between what is supposed to be satire and what is real news. So some steps for identifying fake news with your student is to first ask questions. Why was the story written? Does it make sense? Does the title match the story? Is it just meant for you to click on it to get you to go there? And is it paid or sponsored content? And then you want to check the sources. So you want to ask who wrote the story and why. Does it lean in a political direction? Is it trying to convince you of something? And then you want to make sure that the pictures are real. So pictures can be used out of context or wildly photoshopped, and it can be very realistic. But you can use a Google image search to see when the picture was taken and the context of the picture, and I'll show you an example in the next slide. And then you want to check to see if other credible sources are reporting the same story. So you want to look to see if this story is just a one-off somewhere on an obscure website, or if everybody's reporting on it. Because it's important. If it's something that's really, really big news, then everybody's going to be reporting on it. So using this process in real life, uh, I have two articles here, which are both fake news. So you can looking at the first one, the one with the green header, it's from Natural News, which claim defending health, life, and liberty. And it says Pfizer's COVID vaccine responsible for hepatitis outbreak in children. So we're looking at this with our lens. Why was the story written? Well, it was written to warn parents about something. But does the title match the story? I don't have the story here, but it doesn't. It in fact asks for donations at the end of the story, and for a church. And then it's also from this news source that leans politically right. So it's trying, and then who wrote the story? Is it trying to convince you of something? Well, it's trying to convince you that the COVID vaccine is responsible for a hepatitis outbreak. Usually with credible news sources, you're not going to see something responsible. You're going to see linked to, correlates with association, research finds that vaccine may be responsible. But claiming that it is the sole responsible party for an hepatitis outbreak is irresponsible news. And then the picture is a stock photo called Child in Hospital. And then if you check to see if other credible sources are reporting the same story, no one else was reporting this story. There were other stories that were similar from other anti-COVID vaccine sources, but there was no scientific research done, or any sort of credible source reporting this. So looking at the other one, quickly, the story was written as to say that Hillary Clinton filed for divorce in New York courts. It has a very sensationalist headline of Bill Clinton just got served by his own wife. And the news story was written by the USA-news.com, which I've never heard of before until yesterday when I put this in the presentation. And it's not a very credible source. The picture is from a fundraising video for Hillary Clinton. And nobody else was reporting on this story. In fact, Google disputed it by saying that it was disputed by third-party fact checkers. So sometimes you'll even see this to indicate that it might not be true. So it's important to use the lens of looking for real versus fake news when talking with students, especially if your student is looking to become more politically involved. So there are some important terms that you should employ when talking about elections, because these are things that your student will come across. Ballot, battleground state, campaign, candidate, caucus, Congress, debate, delegate, and so on. And you don't have to know the exact definition. And I think that's true of teaching anyway. You can always look it up with your student, find an appropriate definition, help them define it, and use it in context. All right, so now we're in the electing a president part of the presentation. So 2024 is a presidential election year. So electing a president can be more complicated than it seems. There are 3 steps to the process. The first is choosing a nominee, which happens during primaries, which just happened in Pennsylvania. There are a few states, maybe just one, that do caucuses instead of primaries. A caucus is simply people showing up at a designated location to support their candidate. Um, it's about physical bodies in the room. That is how you cast your vote. Primaries, you're going in and filling out a ballot. Caucuses, you show up and your body is your vote. Now, there are a small number of people called delegates that are chosen in each state to represent the candidates at their party's national convention. Um, and so there are pledge delegates and super delegates. And the pledge delegates promise to support a particular candidate, while super delegates follow rules set by their party, and they have more flexibility. And each state has a number of delegates that's determined by their state population. And these delegates are elected or chosen at a state or local level. So if you voted in this most recent primary, you may have noticed that there was a section for delegates. And those are the delegates that you vote for to send to the national convention. And sometimes they even have under their name who they are pledged to vote for. So the Democratic Party uses a proportional method to award delegates to candidates, while the Republican Party lets states decide between a proportional or winner-take-all system. So in proportional, a proportional method, it's based on the number of votes. So if you have 10 votes and candidate A got 30% of the vote and candidate B got 70% of the vote and you have 10 delegates, then candidate A is going to get 3 delegates and candidate B is going to get 7. But in some places with the Republican Party, there is a winner takes all system. So even if candidate A got 30% of the vote, candidate B gets all of the delegates. So to be officially declared the party nominee, the candidate must win the majority of delegates at the convention. So each party names a candidate, and then the general election process begins. So citizens who are eligible voters can vote for any candidate during the general election, regardless of their political party. And then the Electoral College comes in. And this is where I found a lot of students get very confused. So the presidential candidate who wins the popular vote in a state wins all of the state's electors. And so it's the first candidate to win 270 electoral votes, which is the majority, wins the presidency. So it's possible for a candidate to win the popular vote and not the presidency, as we saw in 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump got 304 electoral votes. So he got the majority of the Electoral College. The Electoral College meets in December to cast their votes, and then the election is confirmed by a joint session of Congress on January 6th. And if that date rings a bell, there's a reason. There was an insurrection on January 6th because of what was happening, which was confirming the election. And certain people did not want that election to be confirmed, and the candidate who was said to have won the election, they did not want confirmed. So Pennsylvania is very important this time around, and in 2016 and 2020 as well. It's because Pennsylvania is known as a battleground state. So when the Constitution was written, a direct popular vote wasn't a very serious consideration. It was an era when people thought were spread throughout the country, and they didn't have communication or developed party system. So elections would frequently end with several candidates so close together that the House of Representatives would decide who the president was. So the District of Columbia and 48 of the states will give all of their electoral votes to the candidate who wins their state. This includes Pennsylvania. So you can see on the map here that the state of Pennsylvania is divided by county here. And we can all agree that it looks mostly red. But upon closer inspection, the blue sections represent the most populated areas within the state, which would be Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Erie, and Pittsburgh. And these areas are notoriously union affiliated and vote largely Democratic historically. So if enough people are mobilized in these cities to vote, there will likely be a Democratic candidate winning the popular vote and winning those electoral votes. But if enough people in the cities are deterred from voting and those living in rural areas are mobilized, then there will likely be a Republican candidate winning the popular vote. So the idea is both candidates of the major political parties are working incredibly hard to get everybody out to vote in their party so that they can win the electoral votes in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania is not the only swing state, battleground state. There are several, but the reason why Pennsylvania might be the most important of all of these battleground states is because we have the most electoral votes of any of these battleground states. We have 20 votes to give, and it's winner takes all. So whoever wins the popular vote in Pennsylvania wins those 20 electoral votes, which is a good chunk. So Pennsylvania is key in the election because all of these other states, the red and the blue, are not always guaranteed for a certain party, but it's very likely that they will vote one way or the other. And so a lot of candidates will focus on Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, Alaska, and sometimes Maine. All right, so your student is a citizen, so they can register to vote. So if you are a US citizen at least 1 month before the election, 18 years or older on election day, so you can register to vote when you are 17 if you'll be 18 by the election, and you live in Pennsylvania for at least 30 days before the election, and you have not been to prison within the last 5 years or have a felony conviction, then you can vote. If you're unsure, you can go to vote.org and go through the checklist with your student to make sure that they are eligible to vote. If you have a felony conviction, but it has been at least 5 years since you have been to prison, then you can vote legally in Pennsylvania. So there are multiple ways to register. The first is online at vote.gov. And the application is available in 21 other languages other than English. You can also register at your county voter registration office. You can mail your form to that office. So those are your ways to register. I've included a blank registration form in the PowerPoint that we are going to send to all of you. And again, you can find it in many languages. All right, so if your student isn't a citizen, or has a felony conviction, or hasn't been living in Pennsylvania very long, you can still be an active participant in elections. And I think this is something that we should always encourage our students to do. You can show up at rallies to support candidates. Even if you can't vote, you can still be a body in the room to support the person that you think is going to make a difference. You can also volunteer for political campaigns. You don't have to be a citizen to knock on doors, make phone calls, send out texts. You can also encourage your friends and family who can vote to vote. Encourage them, offer to drive them. Do whatever you can to help them vote. And then the most important thing that I stress with everybody is that you can write and call your representatives even if you are not a citizen. The representatives are there to represent the people of a state. Politicians don't always know what issues are important to you and to the public until you tell them. So if you feel strongly about immigration or feel strongly about workers' rights, Your student can call or write their representative, even if they're not a citizen, to tell them how they feel, tell their story, tell them what's important and what their representative should be focusing on. All right, so casting your vote. There are some deadlines. So if you want to mail in your ballot, you need to request that mail-in ballot 45 days before an election. If you want to register to vote for an election, you want to do that at least 15 days prior to an election. However, if you want to vote by mail-in ballot and you need to register, then you should register more than 45 days before the election. So there are two options. You can vote by mail-in ballot or you can vote in person. So if you vote by mail-in ballot, there are some important steps. It's important to make sure that if your student asks you for help, that you make sure that there's the official ballot inside of the inner secrecy envelope and then inside of the pre-adjust outer envelope, and that they sign and date it. That is what makes the ballot count. So you can apply for your mail-in ballot online, in person, at your county voter registration office. And then if your student or a voter is unable to complete a mail-in ballot by themselves independently, then they can receive assistance from a person they choose. So if your student does ask you for help, if you feel comfortable, you can do that. All right, so you registered. Now what? Voting for the first time can be really scary. So there are some things that we can do to help. We can help the student identify their polling place and help them make sure their registration is up to date. Students will receive a notice for local elections if their polling place has been moved. Sometimes with smaller local elections, things will be condensed so that there's only one school shut down in the area for the day instead of many. Make sure they know the hours that the polling place will be open. And then when they arrive, they'll need to sign in. You can have them practice with you. Have them practice stating their name and address so that they can be found in the voter log. Have them practice signing their name, and then have them show their ID, which they will need to do the first time they vote. That is required in Pennsylvania. After that, you do not need to bring your ID. And then if they would like to have a sample ballot, they can ask for that when they sign in at the polls. Then you can cover materials with them. Tell them, bring your ID, make sure that you have everything that you need. Voters have the right to bring campaign materials and notes into the booth. So if it helps them to do research ahead of time and write down their selections before going in, that is okay. That's what I do because I am very forgetful, but I think it's very important to do your research. Just remind them, do not take selfies while you are voting. Voting for the first time is exciting, but if you take a picture with your ballot while you're voting, your vote will not be counted if you are discovered. So you can take a selfie before you go into the voting booth, after, with your little sticker, with the polling judges, whatever they want, just not while they're voting. So to check your registration, you'll need a little bit of information, just county, zip code, first name, last name, date of birth. And I have a link to checking your registration here. It's at pavoterservices.gov. And then if your student has moved, change their name legally, either to a different first name, a different last name. If their name has changed from what they registered to vote as, they will need to update their registration, or if they want to change their political party. Those are the 3 times that you'll want to update your registration. And then finding your polling place. You'll need your county, city, street, house number, and zip code. I've included a link here as well. Again, pavoterservices.gov. They don't even need your name for that one, just your address. Voters have a lot of rights, and sometimes it's easy to forget that you have rights in this situation. So if you're in a line, if polls close and you're standing in line, you can stay in line. You are entitled to vote and cast your vote if you are in line when polls close. If you make a mistake on a ballot, you can ask for a new one. It's easy to make a mistake, and it's easy to ask for a new one. And they'll just void the last one, shred it, and done. And then if workers tell your student or tell you that you're not on the list of registered voters, it's important to ask for confirmation that you're in the right place, the right polling place. Make sure that they double check that list, and then ask for a provisional ballot. You are always allowed to vote provisionally if this happens. What will then happen is a judge will review the case and either count the vote or not count the vote later that day. So if you've registered, you know you're registered, you've confirmed it, and then you go in and they tell you you're not on our logs, but you're in the right place and you're really not on there, ask for a provisional ballot. It's also okay to have notes. As I said, you can bring notes in with you to the booth. Just make sure you take them at the end. It's also illegal to use any means to intimidate or attempt to intimidate other voters, either outside or inside the polling location. So you can always ask for help if you need help with something at the polls. And if you are experiencing intimidation, you can call the number 1-877-VOTES-PA, and there are telephone interpreters available. And if there is something happening that is unsafe, if you feel threatened to the point where your safety is threatened, call 911. And then as they stated in that video that we watched at the beginning, there is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provides reasonable accommodations at polls, which means bringing a service animal, asking to be moved to the front of the line if standing is a problem, or asking for a chair, providing curbside voting when it's not possible to go inside. And it's illegal to disqualify somebody because, as a poll worker, because you think they have a mental disability. So if a poll worker is refusing your student the right to vote, then they are in the wrong. Only a judge can decide if somebody has a mental disability and should be disqualified from voting. And then what is very relevant for a lot of us, low English levels. So you have the right to receive assistance if you have trouble reading, speaking, or understanding English. And you can bring someone to help you, such as a friend or a family member. It just cannot be an employer or the judge of elections. So this means that as a tutor, you can go with your student as a friend if your student requests it. And you do not need to get prior permission to have help, but you may be asked to sign a declaration stating that you need assistance. So that would look like this. The declaration will be given to you given to your student at the polling place. Then it will be signed by witnesses and the judge of elections, and then you can help your student if they need help. But this is only if they ask you to help. But hopefully you can prepare them ahead of time and they'll feel confident going by themselves. And then preparing them to use voting equipment. So paper ballots into scanners are the most common in the city of Pittsburgh, but there are voting machines as well. So figuring out which one will be at a polling location, preparing your student for that, either filling in the bubbles if they have low literacy, and showing them, you put it into the scanner, or if you have a machine, making the choices on the machine. All right. So the last part, making a plan. So you can use these questions to guide your conversation, but making a plan has been shown to be the greatest connection to people actually going to the polls and casting their vote. So asking what time you're going to be voting, where are you going to be voting, finding your polling place. Do you have a mail-in ballot or are you going to the polls? Often people will decide that they want to vote in person and then forget that it's election day because there's not a reminder or they get busy. So making a plan about what time you're going to go, morning, afternoon, evening, where you're going, how you're getting there, if you need a ride. If your student needs a ride, there are so many different services and nonprofit organizations that will drive people to the polls. So if they need a ride, you can help them find a ride, or if you can't figure it out, then have them contact me and I'll get them in I'll get them in the right place. If you're going to bring somebody else with you, if you're going to have your kids are allowed to come to the polls and they can go in with you while you vote. So you may not need to secure childcare, but if you do, then make sure that that's something that you plan for. You might need to take off work. A lot of employers are understanding about going to vote, taking an extra 15 minutes on a lunch break, something like that. But planning ahead of time, making sure that your employer will actually give you that time. And then making sure you have the necessary documents to vote, bringing your ID the first time, bringing any proof of address if it's needed. So making this plan increases the likelihood that someone will go vote. All right, so that was a lot of information, and that's what I have for you. Are there questions?
So thank you, Miranda. That was so comprehensive, and I learned several things myself with that presentation. But I had a question. I had heard that on a driver's license application, there's a checkbox
There
about being
is.
a citizen. Can you
Mhm.
talk about that?
Absolutely. So when when filling out the driver's license application, there is a box that says, check this box if you would also like to be registered to vote. And so the application, once submitted, will both be the application for a driver's license and your voter registration. So it's really important that if your student is not a citizen yet, that they do not check the box, that that read the paperwork and make sure that they're following the instructions. Because if you register to vote and you are not a citizen, that is against the law, and could impact your citizenship eligibility later. Um, it is a question on the N-400 form, which is the application for citizenship. Have you ever claimed falsely that you are a US citizen? Have you ever registered to vote in the United States? And you would have to check yes if you accidentally check that. So it's important to read the application thoroughly and make sure that they're paying attention to that box.
Does it actually ask if you're a citizen or just if you want to register?
I believe it just asks if you want to register to vote, but you can't vote until you're a citizen. So, yeah, government paperwork can be confusing. And they have just updated the citizenship application form as well. So it is now even more confusing. Um,
No,
you know,
thank you.
yeah. Are there any other questions? All right. I'm going to stop sharing. And Crystal pointed out that your if your student happens to be in the hospital, UPMC works with an organization called Ballots for Patients. So there's a chance that your student would be able to vote, because most of those hospitals participate in that program. And I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. Thanks, Crystal.
I used to do it. It's not a lot of people like participate in it,
Mhm.
but it is available at most of the hospitals on the day of.
That's
It just
great.
takes a long time because they have to drive. The volunteers from that organization have to take the ballot applications to the courthouse, have them processed, bring them back, have them completed, take them back to the courthouse and file them. So because of that, it's a lot. And it's only for Allegheny County unless they can get volunteers for Westmoreland or
Okay.
Beaver.
Interesting.
Thank you for all that information, Miranda. And I want to, thank Miranda for having this presentation, and thank you guys for joining as well. If you guys do have any questions, we are going to be emailing you some of the materials, so feel free to ask us any more questions. This will also be published in our Tutor Talk YouTube channel in case you guys want to go back and rewatch it or anything like that. Okay. All right. Thank you guys. I'm going to stop the recording.